Hey everyone, and welcome to the very first recorded Campfire Stories for Grown-Ups. We still can't camp in real life just yet, it's coming. And if you saw my live stream last week, you'll know that my attempts to buy a fire pit were completely disastrous and I had to send it back. But never mind, I have a fire behind me, have a lantern to read to you by, all about the spooky lighting, and a little cup of something in my keep cup. So let's get started with the very first campfire story. This one is called The Gambler. Frank squinted as he scanned the half-empty train carriage, a habit so ingrained that he barely noticed himself doing it. At this time, shift workers, oddballs, and the occasional student going back to the university library. He spotted her quickly, a skill he had developed over the years. A tall, slender Oriental girl, about 21 or 22, Frank guessed, judging by her frame. She was reading, and Frank made a mental note to try and glimpse the title of the book before sitting down. Pleased with his luck, gaudy fabric of the seats. Frank enjoyed the word Oriental. He knew you weren't supposed to say it anymore, but it had such an alluring feel to it. He rolled the word around in his mouth. Oriental. Slightly breathless, he collapsed heavily into the seat next to her. She raised her eyes from her book, taking in the spread of Frank's thigh pressing against her own, and the sausage-like fingers with the overly long, manicured fingernails. The short-sleeved shirt that was barely able to contain his distended belly, the buttons stretching dangerously on delicate threads, the salt and pepper beard that did little to mask a sullen mouth. The girl shifted closer to the rain-splattered window, tugging the hem of her skirt out from underneath his cheap polyester suit pants. She turned her shoulder on an angle away from him and returned determinedly to her book, the title of which Frank had forgotten to look at. Never mind. He would pay her a compliment instead. He turned to her, waiting for her to look up. You know, you'd be pretty if you smiled more. Slowly, the girl lifted her head from her book and closed it with a hard snap. You know, she snarled as she stood up and collected her bag. You'd have more luck with women if you weren't such a disgusting pig. She sidestepped across the tightly spaced seats, being careful not to come into contact with Frank as she did so. Bitch, muttered Frank, as she took a seat at the other end of the carriage. Oh well. He ran his fingernails thoughtfully through his beard. There would be plenty more pretty Oriental girls at Madame Cho's tonight, and they had to be nice to him. He was on a winning streak, and tonight was the night he was going to make it big. Madame Cho's was located at the entrance to a narrow, cobbled laneway in Chinatown, populated by sallow-faced addicts who scoured for a meal in the large bins filled with restaurant food waste. The storefront was a butcher's shop, with dozens of duck carcasses hanging in the window, above trays of glistening offal in shades of pearl through to crimson, that were, to Frank at least, unrecognisable. The side door facing into the alley was the one that led to the dimly lit basement, and could be opened with a code that Madame Cho would change each night, ensuring revellers looking for the city's hip, hidden bars didn't stumble in by accident. Frank made his way down the uneven stairs and took a seat at his usual table to wait for Liang. Florence brought him his usual drink, a whiskey sour, and laid out the cards and chips in front of him. He had come to like this place. Sure, the tables were greasy and dust collected on the skirting boards. The fluorescent light above the bar flickered erratically, and the patrons were mostly surly septuagenarians who didn't bother to acknowledge him. But the girls who served the drinks were pretty, and no one seemed to mind that he was one of the few patrons that didn't speak Cantonese. Best of all, everyone minded their own business here. Kevin Leong loped out from the anteroom behind the bronze-coloured curtain. It bothered Frank that he had never seen what was behind it, Why should Liang be able to go in there and not him? His opponent was a tall man in his early 50s, with sunken cheeks and a wide mouth that never smiled. He sat down opposite Frank and humphed a greeting as Florence put a neat bourbon in front of him. "Ready to play?" asked Frank. "I have a good feeling about tonight, Liang. A really good feeling." He shuffled the cards, dealing 2 to each of them, adding 3 to the centre of the table. He glanced at his hand and felt calm. Yes, this was going to be a good night. At each turn of the central cards, Frank raised his bet. With each new round, his hand improved. 3 of a kind, a full house, a straight flush. Finally, Liang slapped his cards face down onto the wooden table. "No more," he said. "Come on," Frank wheedled. "Come on, grow some balls. One more game. You could win it back." With narrowed eyes, he assessed his opponent over the rim of his glass, lovingly fingering the sleek notes piled on his side of the table. He knew Liang wouldn't be able to resist. He just had to be patient. As he waited for an answer, he quietly hummed The Gambler to himself. Now, Frank's problem was he had never known when to walk away, and he had certainly never known when to run. He fixed his gaze on Liang's wrist. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The weeks and months of slowly draining the compulsive gambler dry. He pointed at the bracelet. "You've still got that," he said, shrewdly. The gold bracelet was like nothing Frank had ever seen before. An intricately carved dragon's head set with rubies for its eyes, its body entwined with that of a snake, whose head, set with green emerald eyes, met the dragon's at the clasp. It was clearly very old, very rare, and very expensive. Liang bowed his head. "It doesn't come off," he replied quietly. "Oh, bullshit, Kevin. Let's see it." Liang extended his arm over the table, and Frank grasped his wrist firmly, examining the closure of the bracelet. He squeezed the space where the 2 reptilian tongues met, and smiled as he felt the heavy weight of the bracelet fall into his palm. Liang raised his head in shock and began to laugh as Frank held the bracelet triumphantly aloft. "Okay, Frank. Okay. We play." It was after midnight when Frank turned the key in the door of his cramped second-story bachelor apartment, but there was no way he was going to be able to sleep just yet. He sat on the end of the narrow bed, turning the bracelet over in his hands. He had done it. The beauty he had coveted since first laying eyes on Liang at the casino all those months ago was his. He couldn't resist slipping it over his own fleshy wrist. It was as if it had been made for him. It fit so snugly, and right away seemed to grow warm and familiar as it took on Frank's own body heat. He decided it wouldn't hurt to wear it for a couple of days before he pawned it. He could show it to Julia in HR tomorrow. Now she might finally look twice at him. As was his habit, Frank was the first one to arrive at the office the next day. His rusted Honda Civic backfired loudly as he pulled into the staff parking area of the industrial estate on the treeless outskirts of the city. He swore and glanced around, but the pale dawn sky revealed a still empty parking lot, and he smiled tightly as he heaved himself out from behind the steering wheel. He wouldn't be needing to drive this piece of junk much longer. In fact, he wouldn't be needing to come to this godless shithole for much longer either. All his plans were coming together. Miller & Sons was a small-scale grain trader, and as financial controller, Frank had established a flourishing side business, manipulating the purchase prices he entered into the company's ancient computer system and on-selling contracts at an inflated rate, shifting the balance into an offshore account in the name of a bogus shell company. It wasn't exactly Bernie Madoff-level genius, but the anonymity of the business and the credulous, bucolic family owners made it almost pathetically easy to build his tropical paradise retirement fund. Frank turned on the filter coffee machine in the staff kitchen, glaring resentfully back at the rows of beige cubicles, which his colleagues had tried to brighten with pictures of children, sports awards, and comical desk calendars that were rarely funny once you got past March. As usual, he checked the communal fridge for leftovers and forgotten lunches that would serve as breakfast. Today's offerings were slim: half a ham sandwich of indeterminate age and digestibility, and a small cake with pink icing, on which the baker had piped the words, "Congratulations on your retirement, Suzanne." He hesitated for the briefest of moments and reached for a knife, carving out a slice that said, "Congratulations." He chuckled at his little joke and glanced down at his gleaming wrist. He deserved the congratulations. As he did so, the coffee pot behind him began to hiss and bubble with an alarming noise. The glass jug was overflowing, sending scalding liquid and burnt coffee grounds over the countertops, floor, and Frank's shoes. He swore for the second time that morning and roughly mopped up the mess with a clean tea towel. "Cheap piece of garbage," he muttered to himself. "Typical Millers." He eased into his own narrow, unadorned space as his computer flickered to life, wiping the crumbs of the congratulations cake from his beard as he did so. His inbox produced 3 new contracts that would make a tidy little contribution to the Cayman's account. His day was looking up. He didn't recognise the sellers, new clients, which came with the irritation of having to create new accounts, but the extra work would be worth the payoff. Frank scratched his beard, feeling the comforting heat of the bracelet on his wrist, like an encouraging friend. This could be an opportunity. He was on a winning streak, and new clients always took a long time to get their heads around Miller's dense invoices. He shrugged and doubled the amount of purchased grain he entered into the database. These yokels wouldn't have it figured out before he was on a plane to Bali. And so the morning passed in its usual way, until his desk phone rang shrilly, startling him from his tropical reverie. It was Carol, old Miller's secretary, requesting Frank's presence. It wasn't unusual for the old man to call on him like this. He often wanted a briefing on finances, and it afforded Frank the opportunity to pass by Julia's desk and show off last night's acquisition. He was careful to log out of his computer before ambling heavily to the other end of the office. Julia's cubicle faced away from the corridor, and as Frank approached, he could see her head bowed in concentration, her dark hair knotted in a low bun at the nape of her neck. He was panting slightly from the effort of the walk as he reached her desk, and she turned at the sound of his breath, a scowl at the ready. "Buongiorno, principessa," he wheezed, as he tried to twist his sulky mouth into what he considered a charming smile. He cast his eyes slowly over her. He wasn't actually certain that she was Italian, but it didn't matter. She was gorgeous, tall, curvaceous, with luminous olive skin. The bracelet seemed to tighten on his wrist, reminding him to focus. He collected himself and pushed his arm proudly forward. "Have I got something to show you?" As his hand moved towards her, Frank began to feel odd. Something wasn't right. His hand wouldn't stop. The leer frozen on his face, he stared with shock and fascination as the thick, hairy wrist moved, seemingly with a mind of its own, towards Julia. His bulging fingers were reaching straight for her delicate white blouse. As suddenly as it began, the spell seemed to break, and Julia leapt to her feet, throwing Frank's meaty hand away from her at the same time as she drove her high-heeled shoe into his groin, causing him to double over and gag with pain. Leaving him gasping for breath, she sprinted to Miller's office, and through misted eyes, Frank could see her animatedly pointing back at him as she spoke with Carol. Shit, what had just happened? "Frank!" The office went silent as Miller's voice roared across the cubicles. Several heads popped up like meerkats, and Frank glared at them as he hobbled towards the old farmer's office. He needed to get it together. He He couldn't afford to lose it all now. He'd slipped. Yes, that made sense. He'd stopped to gather his breath and had lost his footing. It was all a simple misunderstanding. His confidence had returned by the time he breezed past Carol and Julia, not stopping to notice the smug smiles that drew across their faces as he went by. Had he done so, he might have had some sense of warning about what was to come. Miller was seated as usual at the oak veneer desk, covered in family photographs and empty coffee mugs. But standing beside him were two men in suits that Frank did not recognise. As they withdrew their identification, everything fell into place. The new clients. He knew they were too good to be true. He'd been set up. All these years of faithful service, and they'd lured him into a trap. Bastards! Frank's mind roared silently. By the time he left the police station, it was after 10 p.m. He paused on the steps outside the glass and concrete headquarters, thinking, it was that stupid slut, Julia. She'd thrown him off his game. If she hadn't run off screaming like that, he would have had a clearer head. He could have talked his way out of this mess with Miller. Hysterical bitch. He drew his hand wearily over his brow, mopping the sweat that had already accumulated in the humid night air. As he did so, he felt the bracelet, tighter than ever, around his wrist. Uncomfortably tight, in fact, painfully so. The red eyes of the dragon seemed to glint at him, mockingly. He stared at it. He'd been a winner, destined for luxury, success, to be loved, until he won this. Could it be, then, not his beautiful co-worker, but this long-coveted treasure that had turned his life upside down overnight? It seemed like madness. He had to find Liang. It was a short walk through the oppressive heat of the city to Madame Cho's. Frank snarled as he pushed roughly through the crowds of tipsy city bankers and university students as they mingled, smoking and talking loudly outside the chic laneway bars. He reached the alleyway, and the noise of the revellers died away. Frank turned, momentarily disoriented by the sudden silence. The lights that usually gave the street a welcoming glow were extinguished. Only a pale pool of light from a street lamp illuminated the boarded-up butcher's shop window. The sign advertising fresh duck hung, squeaking quietly, on one chain. In the distance, someone was playing jazz piano, and a woman laughed. With shaking hands, he keyed last night's entry code into the pad on the anonymous door. It let out 3 rapid beeps, but the handle wouldn't turn. He tried again, and again it beeped, taunting him. He looked around, desperate. One of the alleyway's resident junkies, slouched in the darkness by the locked door, began to laugh. Frank started. He hadn't seen the emaciated man in his desperation to get inside. He turned to leave the alley. He didn't need to be mugged after everything that had happened today. "The snake and the dragon," the man called to Frank's retreating back. "What?" He spun around to stare at the man. His cheeks were hollow and his eyes unfocused as he searched Frank out in the darkness. "The snake and the dragon," he repeated. His voice was polished, educated, jarring with his wasted appearance. "It doubles the sins of anyone who wears it, and will only release them when they can sin no more. Liang knew." Frank stared at the slumped figure and back to the bracelet, hesitating. He felt cut adrift from the certitude that he had once held with such hubris. "Well then," urged the junkie, his words slurring now and his head beginning to nod as the effects of his hit kicked in. "See if you can get it off." Frank squeezed the 2 serpents' tongues, as he had done so easily when sitting across from Liang just the night before. Nothing happened. He squeezed again, and the bracelet seemed to contract more tightly around his wrist. He spun around, searching the darkness of the empty street for, what, divine intervention? Nothing came. Frantically he tugged at the bracelet, yanking the heads of the snake and the dragon, but it was futile. The golden serpents were fixed fast, their grip as strong as their appearance was delicate. Frank screamed in rage and kicked the plyboard-covered window of the butcher shop. It wobbled, and he kicked again, and again, until the cheap board collapsed and Frank's right loafer flew into the dark, deserted shop. Crying real tears now, he clambered awkwardly through the mess of broken glass and chipped wood, fumbling blindly for his shoe. Instead, his hand came to rest on something cold and flat. He ran his fingers across its surface, and a heavy wooden handle told him that it was the butcher's cleaver, abandoned hastily on the checked linoleum floor. Frank drew himself up on his knees, thoughtfully turning the knife in his hand, testing its weight. He made up his mind. Yes, this was the only way. He rolled up his left sleeve and placed his arm carefully across the centre of the thick wooden butcher's block. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness now, and he watched, almost hypnotised, as the bracelet and his hand spun away from him, the green eyes of the snake flashing as they caught the washed-out streetlight trickling in through the broken window. He blinked. Dust particles were dancing in the shaft of morning light that was sliding through a crack in the curtains. He sensed that there was someone else in the room, but the pain medication had made him groggy, and he watched from a narrow slit under his eyelids as the heavy-set nurse busily checked his chart and refilled his water jug. She glanced at him, a small smile twitching at the corner of her pinched lips, when she observed that her patient still seemed to be sleeping soundly. She lifted the miniature paper cup, a cornucopia of coloured pills, from Frank's bedside table. Quickly and silently, she emptied the treasure into her palm, slipping 2 pills into the floral pocket of her uniform and returning 3 to the cup. Her prize secure, she stepped quickly to the window, noisily opening the curtains, flooding the room with light. Frank squinted as the nurse reappeared at his bedside. Her name tag said Judith. "Wakey, wakey," she said, no warmth in her voice. Frank allowed his eyes to open fully, and he smiled at Judith, his saviour. "You've had quite the adventure," she continued as she took his blood pressure. "You're lucky to still be here." As she slid the oximeter from Frank's remaining index finger, her gaze drifted to the gold bracelet resting on the little table. Her eyes were small and narrow, set deeply so that it seemed her doughy cheeks might soon swallow them entirely. Frank saw the greed flash across them as she examined the intertwined golden serpents. He appraised her quietly for a moment. "Go on," he offered, sliding the bracelet towards her. "Why don't you try it on?" The end.